Good morning, everyone. Hello. Good morning. We're about to start our day. Thank you all for being here this super warm morning. Just kidding. It's snowing outside. It's really wonderful to see everyone here. My name is Layla Barigiwa.
My name is Jessie McLaughlin.
And on behalf of the 2020 Toll Scholars class, we are thrilled to welcome you to the 38th Annual SPARE Symposium. To start off the day, I would like to introduce you to the Executive Director of the Toll Public Interest Center and Associate Dean Arlene Rivera Finklestein.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Thank you for the kind introduction, and thank you for allowing me to kick off this day. On behalf of Dean Ruger, it is my absolute privilege and pleasure to welcome you all to the 38th Annual SPARE Symposium. Apologies from Dean Ruger, who's out of town today, and from Professor Woolley, who's a fixture in these events as well. They're out of town together, both lamenting that they are not here with you today. This SPARE Symposium is such an important part of our public service initiatives and traditions here at Penn Law. It is a centerpiece of our commitment to service, and for almost 4 decades has been a key part of our education and our training for action. It was rooted in the vision of Edward Sparrow, who we had the privilege to have as part of Penn Law School so many years ago, a vision that deep academic thinking can partner with hands-on practical experience to devise real-world informed, solution-oriented measures that can promote social justice and social equity. That vision is alive and well today, and boy, is it necessary. As part of our educational mission, it is really, really important to us to be able to work with our students, the absolute best and brightest, who are deeply committed to coming to law school to equip themselves to work towards social change. With all of you, our community partners, our fellow students, our staff, our colleagues, our former students. It's a beautiful thing to see so many alums who are working in the trenches who are here with us today. This is a partnership. It is really easy to be cynical these days. It is much harder to develop solutions. And we learn so much from our Toll Scholars every year as they bring idealism, optimism, activism, and action to a persistent belief that we can and need to work towards social change together. This year's group of students has been absolutely small and mighty. It is a smaller group of Toll Scholars than we have. It wasn't about your height, I'm right there with you. It has been a smaller group of scholars who have assembled a really extraordinary program, and we are thrilled to be able to focus on some of the devastating systemic inequalities that persist in our nation. They have invited an incredible group of individuals to speak with you today. Thanks to all of you who are here already. We look forward to learning so much from you. I will emphasize that our Toll Scholars are part of a larger service corps that we have just created. It's part of our mission to deliver leaders into the social justice community and to train them and to learn from them. It takes a lot of hands to put on today's symposium, and I'd be remiss not to thank so many people. Don't worry, I'm not going to thank every one of so many people. But generally, I would like to say the staff, colleagues, the faculty who supported our students, our fellow students who are all volunteering and here in full force today who have been so supportive. We're learning and growing together. Our own TPIC staff, which is absolutely amazing and supportive to all of our students, with a special thanks to Emily Sutcliffe, who directs our service corps, and to Kanisha Askew, who you all received emails from, and who has been instrumental in working closely with our scholars to make sure that today happens. Lastly, I want to thank all of you, because so much of our work is absolutely so, we are so grateful for your partnership in our service initiatives. We are grateful for all that you do and really hope to continue to add and supplement to that today's symposium. Every year this symposium is really a small thank you to our community and our community partners. And we thank you for being our partners in service. So with that, a big special thank you to our scholars. And I will turn it over to Jessie, who will talk to you more about the selection of today's topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Arlene. I can say from all the Toll Scholars, having Arlene behind us and supporting us is an integral part of our experience at Penn Law School, and a big thanks to Kanisha for making this event happen. So our symposium is titled Divesting from State Violence, Decriminalizing the Social Safety Net. We chose this topic because of our great concern and anger about the crisis of mass incarceration. We wanted to explore how elements of the prison system reach beyond prison walls and into our communities. To do this, we realized that we needed to look beyond prisons themselves to interrogate how state institutions external to prisons deploy the same mechanisms of control, surveillance, and punishment in order to maintain white supremacy and racial dominance. One of our goals for today's symposium is to better understand how personal, social, and economic problems are treated as though they're criminal problems instead of as human needs. As Priscilla Ocen, one of today's panelists, points out, treating social inequality as a law enforcement matter individualizes the problem and lays the responsibility for such problems at the feet of the poor. We've chosen to examine policing, education, and the child welfare system because these are systems and institutions that use surveillance and punishment to criminalize poverty and control those who are poor and or those who are Black and brown. This morning we'll begin with a panel on policing in everyday lives. We begin here because of the pervasiveness of policing in poor communities. We move then to discuss education systems that use exclusionary disciplinary practices to push students of color into the prison system and students with disabilities into settings that mirror, mimic, and feed into these carceral systems. After lunch, we'll talk about how the child welfare system, purportedly intended to protect children, unnecessarily and violently separates children from their parents. We will end our day with Professor Elizabeth Hinton, historian and writer on mass incarceration, who's traced the rise of the carceral state to war on poverty policies that increase the surveillance and control of poor communities of color. We ask that as you listen to each session, you think about the questions that you have, as the audience will take questions at the end of each panel or at the end of the keynote. We ask that you write these questions down on note cards, which ushers will pass out to you, and then near the end of the session, the ushers will collect them and bring them to the moderator. We hope that this will be an opportunity, given the significant expertise here in the room, to discuss the strategies and ideas that all of you have to move forward.
Accompanying our symposium is an art exhibit created by the People's Paper Co-op and the Reentry Think Tank. These are two Philadelphia-based groups that work with women in reentry and those returning from prison to create art that amplifies stories, dreams, and visions for a more just and free world. We are grateful to be able to include this art exhibition in our symposium because it asks each of us to reimagine and re-envision the society in which we want to live. You can see pieces from the art exhibit in the lobby here as well as the library during lunch. So we ask, what does a social welfare system look like in which people can access what they need without being subjected to state control and surveillance? What is the state's response to support families who are struggling and in need? As future lawyers, community members, and activists, we are called to work to abolish systems that uphold white supremacy and state control. Abolition work requires us to do more than tear down the systems that are not working, but also it requires us to reimagine and build differently. We hope you will join us in this project.
Thank you.
Thank you. And now I invite Mariel Musak, who will introduce the next panel.
My name is Marielle. I'm a 2L Toll Scholar, and I'll be facilitating this discussion on policing in everyday lives. If our panelists could please come in and take a seat. Thank you so much for being here. We have a really exciting day ahead of us, and we're really thankful to all of our panelists for making the journey here. I know some of you were far away and the weather wasn't cooperating with us, but I'm happy we're all here. I'm excited to start our discussion. As Jesse and Leila Bari mentioned, in conceptualizing the symposium, we really thought a lot about the various branches of the carceral state that extend outside of prisons, and how institutions that are often supposed to provide benefits and services end up punishing people or further putting them in contact with the police, which is incredibly harmful in low-income communities of color. Before law school, I worked at Community Legal Services here in Philly, and my clients were overwhelmingly women of color facing eviction from public housing. I was astonished at the ways in which living in public housing could both mirror conditions of incarceration in the way that so many restrictions and surveillances are imposed on residents, but could also increase an individual's likelihood of coming into contact with the police to begin with. In her seminal book, Killing the Black Body, Professor Roberts, who we were all lucky enough to have a 1L class with, and who really inspired us in putting the symposium together, she discusses the way in which discriminatory enforcement affects women and women of color by stating, because indigent Black women are generally under greater government supervision, through their associations with public hospitals, welfare agencies, and probation officers, their actions are more likely to be scrutinized and reported. These women are already enmeshed in a social welfare structure that makes them vulnerable to state monitoring in every aspect of their lives. Professor Roberts pushed us to think about this type of surveillance and the ways in which can serve as a tool for social control and behavior modification that disproportionately affects people of color, and particularly women. Her thoughts on this matter really encapsulate many of the issues we wanted to explore during the symposium, and that I hope we'll talk about today. Later today, we'll have panels on the education system and the child welfare system. So our first panel, I hope, can really set the scene for those more in-depth discussions by discussing what policing actually looks like, and thinking about what community accountability could look like if it wasn't always rooted in punitive action. Our three amazing panelists have an incredible amount of expertise, and they've written extensively on these topics and specifically on policing, and I'm looking forward to hearing their thoughts on a lot of these issues. Priscilla Ocen is a professor of law at Loyola Law School, where she teaches criminal law, family law, and a seminar on race, gender, and the law. Her work explores the ways in which race, gender, and class interact to render women of color vulnerable to various forms of violence and criminalization. She's published extensively in legal journals and general audience publications, and she's also the co-author of an influential policy report titled Black Girls Matter, Pushed Out, Overpoliced, and Underprotected. She's also applied her work to a variety of broader advocacy efforts. Derecka Purnell is the Skadden Fellow Staff Attorney at the Advancement Project. And her project works on supporting local and national movements that dismantle state violence, divest from punitive criminal measures, and invest in community control of safety. In August of 2014, Derecka was part of the Ferguson uprising, and she was also a legal observer or trainer in various of the later uprisings in St. Louis, Boston, and Baltimore, and she helped organize legal strategies and clinics for police brutality victims. Her work has appeared in various publications, including a fantastic article on what police abolition means that I would recommend to the audience. And finally, Andrea Ritchie is a police misconduct attorney and organizer whose research, litigation, and advocacy has focused on policing and criminalization of women and LGBT people of color for the past 2 decades. She's currently a researcher in residence on race, gender, sexuality, and criminalization at the Barnard Center for Research on Women. She's also the author of a fantastic book titled Invisible No More: Police Violence Against Black Women and Women of Color. She's co-author of various policy and research reports, and she's a nationally recognized expert on policing issues. So let's get started. Thank you so much to all the panelists for being here. So I know I read just kind of a short bio for each of you, but maybe if you could just explain the work that you're doing now, just so that the audience can have some grounding in that.
Sure, I'll start. So a lot of the bulk of the work that I'm doing right now is exploring ways to, so right now I'm serving as the vice chair of the Los Angeles Civilian Oversight Commission for the Sheriff's Department in LA County, which is one of the largest law enforcement agencies in the country. In LA County, we have the largest jail. We're the largest jailer in the country, which means that we have the largest mental health institution in the country, which means that we have, I'd argue, one of the largest public housing projects in the country. We have one of the largest rates of, or one of the highest rates of uses of force and the deadly force. And so part of the work that I'm doing is trying to figure out ways to shrink. As a very avowed abolitionist, I'm in a very tenuous position, I think, as vice chair of this oversight body. One of the biggest fights that we have right now is trying to shut down a proposed $3.5 billion jail building project that includes a $2 billion women's facility that's being called gender responsive, that would move women out of downtown Los Angeles out to a facility in Lancaster that's being repurposed from a former ICE facility to hold roughly 2,000 women. So I think we're going to be talking about the relationship between immigration enforcement and the criminal legal system. So I think that this is one, I think, important point. So part of the work that I'm doing is trying to figure out ways to leverage formal institution for abolitionist purposes, to figure out what are abolitionist reforms that we can get behind and what are what Miriam Caba calls non-reformist reforms that we should oppose. And I think a gender-responsive jail is a non-reformist reform that we should oppose. And so far we have been successful in trying to gum up the works, and I'm proud to say very recently that our civilian oversight body passed a resolution in opposition to that jail project, and we've been able to get 2 of our 5-member Board of Supervisors to come out in opposition to that jail, and we need 4 of the 5 in order for that project to proceed. So as of now, it looks like that jail project is not going to go forward. So we're very pleased with that in LA County. The other project that I'm looking at is the non-custodial population. I am a fellow with an organization, a literary organization called PEN America. And one of the areas that I've been really focused on is the custodial population, looking at how women experience being in jail, prison, or detention centers. And there are roughly 200,000 women that fall into that category across the United States. But when you look at the bulk of women who are under criminal supervision, most women are not incarcerated. Most women are on probation or parole. Roughly 1 million women, or between 800,000 and 900,000 women, are on probation or parole. And what I found in sort of talking to women, and a lot of this work is doing a lot of interviews, narratives with probation officers, with women themselves, with public defenders, is that there's this sort of churn of women who are put on probation, required to pay these ridiculous fees and fines, to report, to drug test, and it puts them on this constant state of surveillance that puts them on a path to basically deferred incarceration. In some states, including the state of Georgia, which has a rate of essentially 1 in 18 people who are on community supervision. I'm sure you all know here in the state of Pennsylvania, you have one of the highest populations of folks who are on community supervision. It's essentially, in the state of Georgia, roughly 45% of new admissions in prison are folks who are being put there because of violations of community supervision. So I really think that we need to be talking about community supervision, which is often described as a more humane form of criminal punishment, as what it is, another form of unfreedom. So those are the two projects that I'm really focusing on right now, which certainly do intersect with some of the other systems that you were just describing, including immigration, foster care, especially when you're talking about young people, the welfare system, and others. So I'm happy to talk more about that when we get further into the discussion. Thank you for having me.
Thanks.
Good morning.
Good morning.
This is the land of Meek Mill. Y'all Meek Mill fans? Oh, okay. Are y'all Mumia fans?
Yes.
Oh,
Free
all right.
Mumia.
Free Mumia. Okay, all right. So my name is Derecka. Is it Mario?
Marielle, thank you.
Yes, said in the introduction, I'm a Skadden Fellow, staff attorney at Advancement Project, which is nationally headquartered in DC. Even though we're based in DC, we have a lawyer, organizer, communications model that we use to support campaigns across the country in Puerto Rico. And so I support 3 programs and 3 sites. So one site is in Ferguson, Missouri. After the uprising, there was a DOJ investigation into the city of Ferguson and the police department. So I work with community organizers to put pressure on the city of Ferguson and on the Department of Justice to issue, to bring to life the most radical parts of the consent decree, because it's pretty terrible, even though of all the consent decrees, it's probably the most progressive. And so I help organizers sort through the 390-something paragraphs to think, about what's gonna release the most amount of people from the criminal legal system in Ferguson. How do we get some of the city to repair some of the harms that they used for the unconstitutional and constitutional policing that's robbed people of, wealth and all of their racist profiling practices. And then I help them think about ways to draft municipal codes that's in the city that they can use to do more radical work. For example, eliminating ban-the-box or putting in a ban-the-box ordinance so that folks who are coming out of jails and prisons don't have to use arrest records or won't be subject to review for their criminal records if they want to get employment in the city of Ferguson. So we look broadly within this consent decree and we try to figure out, okay, how can we make use of this reformist tool for the organizers' advantage and for the people of Ferguson's advantage. And that, like I said, that ranges. I also help them testify every time there's a federal consent decree hearing and really try to help them think through what's going to be the most persuasive arguments to use for the judge to either shrink the power of the city of Ferguson and reduce contact between the police department and citizens or people who are living in the city, or put pressure on the DOJ. I know that there was a couple of articles that came out, it's like, whoa, what's gonna happen now that Sessions, became Attorney General, and what are these consent decrees what are they gonna mean under Trump? And so we try to think about all the strategic ways to put pressure on the court, to monitor the Department of Justice, to basically be responsive to the community demands. Another area I'm really excited to be working on is a campaign in St. Louis called the Close the Workhouse campaign. And so we're trying to shut down a local jail, which is called the Workhouse. And it's called the Workhouse because when it opened originally, if you couldn't afford to get out of debt, you would have to go there and do what? Work, exactly. So there's a campaign called Close the Workhouse that I'm really excited about. Do you guys watch Queer Eye? Yeah, so it's like Queer Eye. but with like abolitionists, and we're trying to like make the campaign change to like meet the needs of like the people in St. Louis. It's really, really exciting work. And that also ranges. So it's just like the excitement of movement lawyering that sometimes I'm helping, people organize, think strategically and do power mapping about the other campaigns that are in the city or in the country. And then we have to think through, okay, what's on the calendar? What are the electoral races who are coming up? Who's the most candidate is going to be sympathetic to closing down this jail? Then it's also how are we training canvassers to speak to the everyday needs of people living in St. Louis. Because St. Louis, is my hometown. It has one of the highest murder rates in the country. So when you go and knock on doors and say, we're trying to close down the jail, people are gonna say, whoa, well, what about the people who kill people? And so a lot of my work is helping organizers think through those questions. What about people who kill people? What about people who commit sexual assault? How can we be responsive to the needs of people who are most vulnerable to community-based violence, to domestic violence, to police violence, and give them actual, tools to think through some of these problems. So when we have an abolitionist campaign, we're building buy-in and we're building community investment, and we're inviting people to join us in the struggle to figure out the best answers and best solutions to the problems that they face every day. So I am so excited. There's a report that we released last August, and just a few days ago, we filed bail litigation against the city of St. Louis for unconstitutional bail practices. And the idea is that if we can stop the city using these bail practices to keep people locked up, that will shrink and reduce the population of who's in the jailhouse, of who's in the workhouse, which is 90% pre-trial detention. And so I just graduated law school a couple of years ago. That was my first piece of litigation, y'all. I'm so excited. So I'm really excited about this litigation. I think litigation is a very weak tool for change, but to the extent it can get some of our folks free, we probably should entertain it a little bit. And then the most recent project that I'm excited about is actually very, very new. And so in my introduction, I said across the United States and Puerto Rico. And before I started doing work in Puerto Rico, I had this very liberal idea that Puerto Rico should be a state, right? Like, why isn't it a part of the United States? What's going on? And after spending time with a bunch of organizers there, they're like, we want to be free. We're not trying to be a state. We're trying to be independent. And I was like, oh, snap. Like, I think that's right. And so, interestingly, when the hurricane happened, Hurricane Maria a couple of years ago, there was this trolling, if you guys are familiar with the term, of people who were just like, we shouldn't give foreign aid to Puerto Rico. And there was this huge criticism of all those people who were, I guess, conservative on the right, who didn't understand the colonial relationship between the United States and Puerto Rico, but a bunch of people who are liberal or left of center who also, take for granted that colonial relationship. So I'm really excited to now be doing work in Puerto Rico and working with this group, Talib Salud, who is an abolitionist feminist collective that started about 40 years ago. And they do a bunch of work, everything from providing mental and gender-based services to women who are in Loyola, which is the predominantly Black neighborhood/city in Puerto Rico. But the project that we're helping them with is a project on reducing community-based violence and murders without the police. So what they've done is taken a model like ceasefire, which is usually heavily reliant on police intervention or prosecutor intervention. Someone shows up at your door, knock on it, and say, turn away from your life of crime before you get caught up in the system we're watching you. And instead, what this collective has done is built trust with people in the community who are the most violent perpetrators. And they said, we are not involved in the police. They're explicitly not involved in the police to maintain those relationships. And they're drastically reducing the amount of community-based violence. And so we're really excited to work with them and support their work. And I'll stop there.
Thanks and congrats.
Thank you.
No, I wanted you to keep going. I was like...
Also, really quickly, I'm such a fan of both of these people. I don't even know how I'm in the middle right now. I brought my book so Andrea can sign.
I am also on a panel with my sheroes, so I'm not quite sure. And then this is like a day of Black feminist brilliance. So I just really want to thank you and commend the organizers for pulling together such an amazing group of folks, but also for engaging these questions that I think are really incredibly critical at this time. So particularly as criminalization is being mobilized to advance kind of every right-wing agenda in the current political climate. So I just really want to appreciate the organizers and also can't believe I get to be here. I also want to honor the original people of this land whose genocide makes our presence possible, the formerly enslaved African descended people who built many of the institutions in this city, and all the folks who can't be in this room for reasons of disability access or immigration, exclusion, deportation, et cetera. In addition to the things that Marielle mentioned, in terms of who I am, I'm a Black lesbian, an immigrant, and a survivor of interpersonal and state violence. And I say all those things because they may not be immediately apparent, but they all deeply shape the work that I do. Something that's also not in my official bio, and I don't even know if she's still here, if she wants me to say this, but Dean Rivera Finklestein and I go back several decades from when we were at Cornell together, where we both worked at, believe it or not, a rock and roll radio station. So
Wow.
I say that, news, rock and roll DJ. And I say that to say that, you know, career paths are, you know, diverse. And people often say to me, how did you start this work? Like, where do I take the program that gets you to where you are? And I'm like, well, first you become a rock and roll DJ, then you're an agricultural worker and a domestic worker, and then, you know, whatever. So, but I have spent the past 20 years researching, writing, advocating, organizing, litigating, just generally agitating around police violence against women of color and LGBT people of color. So I most recently published this book, but also co-authored the report Say Her Name, Resisting Police Brutality Against Black Women, and a book called Queer Injustice, The Criminalization of LGBT People in the United States. With all due respect to Penn Law, I'm a proud graduate of Howard University School of Law. Are there any fellow Bisons in the room? Yeah. I was in private practice for 15 years. Also, I was a late law school attendee, so if there's any, you know, what do we call us, mature students or something? Anyway, just want to lift y'all up because it's not easy. And I was in private practice for 15 years as a police misconduct attorney, and did impact litigation like Derecka. My first case out the box was like, let me take on the NYPD's practice of gender searching trans and gender nonconforming people as a Monell pattern and practice. I recommend making sure you have a mentor if you're going to do that. It's going to take on the biggest police department in the country. And also, you know, continued in that vein, also did some work in New Orleans challenging the mandatory sex offender registration requirement for folks who were convicted of a crime called solicitation of crime against nature. Ask me about that, I'll tell you more about it. And got to co-counsel with David Rudofsky, who's a professor here, to eventually remove 800 people, 90% of whom were Black women, from the sex offender registry. Wow. Based on that charge. And also done just represented, you know, individuals in cases of police misconduct to Black high school students, girls who were beaten on the subway by NYPD officers who called them Shaniqua while they did it, you know, Black trans women who were profiled for walking down the street with 9 condoms in their purse, Black lesbians who were beaten outside a club, a Latina trans undocumented woman who was beaten inside her own home by officers during a vice sting, really kind of looking at the ways in which state violence manifests in particular against Black women, trans people of color. And throughout this time, I also engaged in research and policy advocacy. I was a founding member of New York City's Communities United Against Police Reform, the campaign that took on and challenged stop and frisk practices there. Helped to draft and advocate for the passage of one of the more comprehensive anti-profiling pieces of legislation in the country, in New York City and nationally. Challenged the practice of using condoms as evidence of intent to engage in prostitution. How many of y'all have condoms here right now? And related to that was sort of laws around making officers advise you of your right to not consent to a search when there's no other legal basis for the search, and just generally advocating around policies governing police interactions with LGBT people, pregnant people, and sexual violence by police officers. And currently I'm supporting about 40 groups around the country who are engaged in campaigns around policing and criminalization, and in the previous administration also did a lot of work at the federal level at the DOJ and the White House in terms of trying to center women and LGBT people in national conversations around policing. And I'll just say that most recently at Barnard, I launched the Interrupting Criminalization Research to Action Initiative with Mariam Kaba, who was mentioned, and I'm sure we'll talk a great deal about today, to recognize that, as Professor Ocen suggested, women are in fact the fastest growing prison and jail populations and have been for the past 4 decades. And the rate of growth of women in prison and people incarcerated in women's prison has outpaced that of men's by 50% over that period of time. 42% of people incarcerated in women's prisons identified as lesbian, bi, trans, or gender nonconforming before their incarceration. And 1 in 2 black trans women will experience incarceration in their lifetime. So if you watch the 13th or read the new Jim Crow, you'll hear that 1 in 3 black men will experience incarceration, but in fact, black trans women, if you look at the data through that lens, are the group experiencing the greatest rates of incarceration in this country. If you look at it through the per capita lens, Native people experience the greatest rates of incarceration in this country, and that's also kind of a forgotten story. So the idea of this initiative is to figure out what policing practices, we know what economic, social, political, cultural practices are driving those numbers, but what policing practices and policies can we intervene on that are driving these numbers and try and interrupt this process of criminalization? And to just note that it's, as Priscilla was saying, it's not just about who's incarcerated, it's also about who's criminalized, right? And so there's maybe 2 million people locked up right now, but there's 9 million people under control, some kind of carceral control, and there's 10 million arrests every year. So 10 million people coming into contact, or 10 million times people are coming into contact with this system and trying to figure out what that's about. And I think for women, we know it to be mostly about the war on drugs, but also about the criminalization of poverty and parenthood and gender and sexual and reproductive autonomy and of self-defense and survival. So what do we do with people who kill people? What do we do with people who kill people in self-defense because they're being abused and no one's protecting them, right? Or who are perceived to be harming their children when they're really trying to survive poverty. And how should these realities shape the work that we do to end mass incarceration and criminalization? Because there's a recent study by the Prison Policy Institute that showed that over the past 10 years, the number of men incarcerated, or people incarcerated in men's prisons has gone down, thanks to the reforms that we've been engaged in. But the number of people incarcerated in women's prisons has continued to go up. And in 35 states, it's either the decline in men's population is overshadowed by the increase in women's population or severely undermined by that. So if we are really going to tackle mass incarceration and criminalization, then we have to look at it through the lens of the experiences of women, queer, and trans and gender nonconforming people. I'll just end by saying that, the reason I think the questions that we're engaging today are so important is that criminalization is really increasingly becoming the default response to every social problem and harm. It's also the means of covering up or shielding us from seeing the kind of raw consequences of the neoliberal economic policies of the past 4 decades. And it's a tool to advance the right-wing agendas in the current political climate. And criminalization isn't just about enforcement of neutral or even discriminatory laws that can be changed or reformed through reformist reforms. It's actually the process of deeming entire groups of people criminals. Whether it's immigrants, youth of color, black women, trans people, poor people, people with disabilities, which then normalizes discrimination, dehumanization, punishment, and exclusion, which is facilitated by laws that can't be addressed by civil reform because, you can strike down black codes, you can strike down cross-dressing laws, and then new legal regimes will simply accomplish the same results. Under sort of ostensibly race-neutral laws in ways that are really difficult to challenge under existing constitutional frameworks and cultural norms. So I think the idea of divesting from state violence really requires us to explore and challenge and confront and divest from criminalization as a response to social problems and harms, including the ones that we think of as the most serious or the most severe. So those are the questions I hope that we can engage today.
Thank you so much, and I think a lot of your intros maybe have answered some of the questions that I have prepared. Just one reminder for the audience, if you have any questions you would like to ask at the end, we ask that you write them on one of the note cards that are being passed around, and then we'll read those at the end. So my first question, I guess, when we're thinking about decriminalizing the social safety net, if maybe, and I know you guys think about these from maybe some different angles or different systems, but if you could speak about ways in which people who access government assistance or social assistance encounter the police, and just some examples of that to begin with.
I just talked for a long time. And you wrote the article about it that I learned half of what I know about it.
So, I can give you all one example of how this sort of works out. So I'll just start by saying that the way in which our welfare system is structured upon an assumption that people who need to access social benefits are deviant, right? That their need for social services is an indicator of pathology, right? Is an indicator of a need for discipline and correction by the state, right? And I'm gonna sort of evoke a case that I think signals the sort of underlying ideology of pathology that accompanies social welfare benefits. So it's a case called Wyman versus James, a case decided in, I believe, 1971, 1972, authored by Justice Blackmun when he first joined the court, right? So it's this case, this black woman named Miss James out of New York, right? She's applying for social welfare benefits, and at the time, New York State required a home visit, right, in order for her to maintain her benefits. And Ms. James said, I don't want y'all in my house, right? As part of the visits, that they were, super intrusive. They would come in, right, rifle through her drawers, look in her trash, go through her bathrooms, look through her medicine cabinets, go through her kitchen, open up her refrigerator, go through her closets, look to see if there was evidence of a man living with her, see how long he was staying with her, probably look for evidence of condoms, right? Super intrusive, right? And so she didn't want these social workers going through her home. And so she said no. And she was then told that her benefits would be terminated. She appealed and she lost. She went and filed suit alleging that this was a violation of her privacy. Went up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said no, that this was not a search. It did not implicate the Fourth Amendment, that this was basically somewhat therapeutic, that this was being done for her own good, right? That the state was doing this to ensure that children weren't being abused, right? This was Justice Blackmun's rationale, essentially, that this wasn't being done for criminal purposes, that this was a social worker coming in to really help people, poor people like Mrs. James, who, right, really didn't know any better how to manage their own money, right? If she was asking for support for, let's say, a new bed or clothing, right, that the social worker needed to come in and make sure that that's in fact what she needed. That the social worker needed to come in and make sure that things were okay, that the social worker needed to come in and make sure that the child was not being abused and so forth, right? That there's this presumption that the mother was dysfunctional, couldn't manage her own affairs, and that she needed the assistance of the state, and that the home visit was a part of that essential regime, right? That there was this assumption that she was pathological. Now, some of y'all, I assume, get student loans. How many of y'all get student loans?
Still paying.
I got some student loans. I still pay the student loans. How many of y'all get home visits? Did y'all, anybody get home visits to make sure that y'all spend it? How many of you spend those student loans appropriately all the time? Okay, one. I'm sure that is not true. Right, so there's this presumption, right, that only welfare, right, I'm sure farmers don't get, right, there are a lot of folks that get a lot of benefits from this government that don't get the level of scrutiny that welfare recipients do, right, because there's this underlying assumption that they are undeserving, that they are basically criminal. And I can cite a long line of cases where this presumption is essentially legitimized in law. Another case, a more recent case, a case that was decided by the Ninth Circuit, I believe it was in 2003, a case called Sanchez versus City County of San Diego. Another home visit case. This time a poor Latina was applying for benefits, and again, she didn't want her home visit. This time, it's not a social worker. This time, it's a sworn fraud investigator from the district attorney's office who's coming to her home. And whose findings could lead to felony fraud charges. If there's any disjuncture between what she put on her application and what that fraud investigator finds in her home, she could be facing felony charges, right? Now, this goes to the Ninth Circuit. The Ninth Circuit says there's no problem with the search, relying on Wyman versus James, but even going beyond that, the Ninth Circuit relies on a case called Griffin versus Wisconsin. And if any of you have taken criminal procedure, Griffin versus Wisconsin is a case that essentially says people who are on probation don't enjoy the same Fourth Amendment rights that the rest of us do. Why? Because they've been adjudicated as guilty, or they pled guilty, or they've been adjudicated as guilty of a crime, right? And so when police encounter them, they can search them. There are these things called probation searches, and we can talk more about that, right? So they don't have to have probable cause, reasonable suspicion in order to search folks who are on probation. And so the court cites Griffin versus Wisconsin to say folks who are on welfare have a diminished expectation of privacy, basically saying they are probable criminals, right? So you have this case law saying, one, folks on welfare don't have the same rights to the same Fourth Amendment rights as the rest of us, right? That these aren't searches because they need guidance and discipline because they're pathological and can't govern themselves. They're irresponsible inherently, that they're more likely to be criminals, and so it's okay, or they're essentially on par with folks who are in this class of criminals. We can question that separately, but we'll place that there. And so what kind of an environment does this create? And so I'm going to talk about a case that I worked on when I, just a few years out of law school, when I was working for an organization called the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights in San Francisco. There was a group of black women who moved to a city called Antioch. And this was just after the Great Recession. A lot of homes were just sort of laying fallow. There's a lot of overdevelopment. We could talk about capitalism, right? There's a lot of overdevelopment in Antioch, and a lot of black women who had Section 8 vouchers were moving in, basically to stave off a lot of foreclosures in that environment. This was formerly a sundown town. And a lot of white folks and some black folks didn't like these black women and their families moving into this community. So they went to the city council, started complaining. A community action team of a specialized police force was formed basically to police these black women. And instead, and these police officers used the fact that these women were on Section 8 as an entry point to regulate them, right? So they handed out flyers and asked, do you know anybody who's on Section 8? Right, and if there was any kind of a complaint or a disturbance, they were using those complaints and forwarding them to the housing authority to try to get those leases terminated. We had one particular case that was egregious where a client of ours complained about an incident where she was being abused by her partner. She called the police to complain about domestic violence. The police came like hours later, and they came and asked her questions about the person who abused her. And they were walking all throughout her home, looking around, going like Miss Wyman, going through her closets, you know, looking around in the drawers, taking pictures. And she started to ask questions like, you know, are you going to investigate the person who actually did this to me? Or are you going to go look for him? They ended up submitting all of the evidence that they gathered when they came in response to her call to the housing authority, arguing that she had an illegal occupant to terminate her housing, right? So the fact that she had this housing made her vulnerable to policing. It made her vulnerable to lose her housing, and it made her a heightened target for scrutiny, right? So it was only because she was on, not only, but in addition to her blackness, in addition to her poverty, and it was because of her housing that made her a heightened target for police violence, right? So like Ms. James, like Ms. Sanchez, this particular client became another target for police violence because of her vulnerability as a Section 8 recipient. So I think that's another example of the ways in which being a welfare recipient makes one vulnerable to state violence, in particular, in this case, police violence.
I have a quick,
Yeah, please.
just I was gonna tell a similar story for what's happening in Ferguson right now with mass evictions, but I think you talked about in your clinic how it was the first time you noticed the way that people are vulnerable to police violence and surveillance. So what happens when someone's on Section 8 or they have these vouchers is that the terms of the conditions in which they must maintain their vouchers, it has at least two effects, right? So in one way, it extends the surveillance state by making police out of landlords. So now your landlord is essentially is an extension of the carceral state because they have the power to evict you based on arrest records, based on any of these broad conditions that you have to maintain or subscribe to if you're going to maintain your housing. And so police know that they get to constantly put you in a state of vulnerability of being arrested, surveilled, force you to like reveal information. Also, you won't lose your Section 8. And I don't know if you guys know people who are on Section 8, but I personally do have people in my family who are on it. Sometimes it takes people years to get a voucher. And so if I'm caught between giving you a piece of information or allowing you to come to my house to do a search or letting a landlord exploit me and giving them money on top of what my Section 8 voucher is covering, it forces people rather to engage in behaviors that make them even more vulnerable to police violence. And so if you have a landlord who's now going to use the threat of police, what they're actually doing is they're acting as a state agent, right? They're acting as an extension of the carceral state. The second thing that it does is that it subjects the people in the house to the conditions of the Section 8 voucher as well. So it increases, their likelihood that they're criminals or that they're targets. And so, for example, one of my clients when I was in law school in a housing clinic, she had a Section 8 voucher and her son was being, harassed by police officers. And the landlord witnessed the harassment and threatened to evict my client because her son was being harassed by cops. So now everyone in that house is kind of like on probation, or everyone in that house is subject to the terms of these conditions, which means that her visitors, can't have arrest records. She could be evicted for that. Her son actually did get arrested, and then, the landlord was, trying to evict her, and we had to fight against that. But people who are coming to visit you, your children, now they are extensions of the carceral state as an additional population of people who are now being surveilled. And so, thinking about Section 8 vouchers and thinking about people who are on public assistance, the reach is not just to that person, their immediate family, right? It's to their neighbors who are now subject to, being told on or information given to police officers because that person who has the actual voucher doesn't want to lose their home, or they don't want to be exploited, or they don't want to experience violence. So the reach through public welfare agencies and these programs make people more vulnerable by extending it frontwards and backwards.
Thanks. And Derecka, I really appreciated what you said about the wait list. Just for some context, in Philly, the Section 8 wait list is currently closed, which means no one can apply. But for people who have applied, the average wait time is around 10 years.
And I think this, what was being talked about is this process of criminalization, right? And that particularly that it's racially gendered, in the sense that when social assistance was something that was not accessible to Black women, then the presumption of criminality, it was more like, oh, poor orphans and widows, and we're not going to go in their house and investigate everything that they're doing. But as soon as Black women start being able to access these benefits, then this myth of the welfare queen is projected to then allow criminalization. So I'll just add to what folks were saying is around how this intersects with the war on drugs, right? Your caseworker comes in. If you're white, you get to be a marijuana mom and have some weed lying around and, your bowl or whatever, right? But if you have the same stuff in your house and when the caseworker comes by, then it's a whole other story. And not only that, but your Fourth Amendment right to not be drug tested in some states is eliminated as a condition of getting your social benefits and entitlements. And, you know, I've literally seen lawmakers who are paid by the state say, well, if the state is paying your support, then you shouldn't be able to use or buy drugs with that. And then I think it was actually John Oliver or somebody who was like, oh, so we're going to start drug testing you now too, right? And he was like, oh, no. It's like, but isn't your salary from the state? Like, so it's literally, the law doesn't, it's a process of criminalization. It's not about like the logic of it, right? The logic is the process of criminalization. And I just want to emphasize what Derecka was saying about police using the threat of calling caseworkers or getting your housing cut off as a way of bullying people, but also extorting sex from them, right? And or the threat of calling child welfare workers if your kid's playing outside and they're like, oh, well, that could be seen as neglect, and I'm going to call the caseworker unless XYZ. And just lift up the work that people are doing to resist some of this stuff too. BYP 100 in New York City has a home campaign, which is sort of challenging the way people are policed in public housing to, one, eliminate the permanent exclusion of folks with certain criminal convictions, which can be littering. And then secondly, the ways in which the entire house is policed and the ways in which police then show up in the house to be like, oh, is that person here? They shouldn't be here. And as you mentioned, the thing about the Ferguson investigation, that was one of the many things they documented in terms of the experiences of black women in Ferguson. And the conversation about Ferguson ends up being about Mike Brown, rightfully. But a lot of what the investigation showed was that black women who, for instance, call for help when they're experiencing domestic violence, the cop shows up, as in Priscilla's client's case, and it doesn't do anything about the domestic violence, but starts investigating whether they are meeting their conditions of their Section 8 voucher or the public housing, and end up arresting them, the survivor, for some other kind of violation that's related to the regulation through the criminalization of access to benefits.
And I also want to note, in the case that I described, and I talk more about this in a law review article called The New Racially Restrictive Covenant, is in the case that in another city where this is happening, also in Lancaster, where they want to build this new women's jail, was that the police partnered with the local school district. They partnered with the Department of Child and Family Services. They partnered with the Housing Authority, and so they put together these multidisciplinary teams to do these home searches, which were authorized by essentially the administrative warrants that the Housing Department had, so that they had authorization to go into these women's homes. So not only did women risk losing their homes and their housing vouchers, they risk losing their children, and they risk essentially being criminalized because of not only was this civil child abuse, but this also could be criminal child abuse. So there were so many different consequences that flowed from the initial point of vulnerability, which was the Section 8 housing voucher. And the sort of the demonization, the ways in which they were being pathologized as a result of being poor black women, especially with children who are on Section 8 in some of these communities across the country.
And I know we need to move on. I just want to say, like, literally, it's about the state being able to come into your house. That is like a point of entry for, well, one, the criminalization process allows the state to come into your house, and then that becomes a mechanism of criminalization, right? So literally think about what's going on in your house right now, and imagine if the state came in and started looking around and found whatever you might have there. And maybe it's that your child's hair is uncombed today because you had to get ready for class and you had to do this and you had to do that, or maybe their shirt's not quite as clean as it needs to be, or their diaper hasn't been changed immediately. It's about who gets to get away with that, because that kind of stuff happens in houses across the country every day, and who gets criminalized for that. And it's really about who doesn't have privacy rights, and then what happens when people walk into the house and then start looking around.
I was gonna say really quickly, ironically, that I know we have to move on.
No,
So
go
sorry, because just thinking about who gets criminalized. My understanding, and from a couple of articles that I read, is that the largest recipient of welfare benefits in New York City, are Hasidic Jews. And they have a police force. They have you guys know what I'm talking about? They have a group of people who they essentially deputize to go and patrol people, and they have, numerous incidents of racial violence and bias against black people in New York City and Brooklyn. And so could you imagine that if these same black women who were being criminalized developed a police force and then went and enforce laws or, served as their own, it just wouldn't happen because they're not criminalized the same way.
Thanks. And just to mention, Professor Ocen's article is in our bibliography, which is in the program, and I would encourage you all to read that as well. So I think the next thing I wanted to talk about was information sharing, and I think there's a few ways in which that can happen, both between the police and public and private institutions such as hospitals, welfare agencies, housing authorities we've mentioned, but also, of course, between the police and ICE. So if any of you could speak to one or some of those concepts.
There's much to say about ICE, police, and social service collaboration, particularly in this moment. But just know that the more data there is, the more it gets shared around. And sometimes data that you haven't thought would be a problem becomes a problem, right? So one of the fights I had in federal advocacy, sometimes with allied LGBT organizations, was they were like, oh, the police should collect data on people's sexual orientation and gender identity so that we can track police violence against LGBT people. And I was like, are you, what? No. And then, I don't, there's so many reasons, right? That's gonna produce some of the violence that we're trying to stop. That's going to have intrusive questions about, there's just so much, everything we're trying to stop that would facilitate and give a legitimate excuse for. But also, I don't want a government record of what a police officer thinks my gender identity or sexual expression or sexual orientation is, or what I might have told them at one moment in time, which might change. And under Obama, everybody was like, oh, Andrea, you're just being paranoid. Now Mike Pence is vice president. I'm like, okay, do you see now why I don't want a government record of people's sexual orientation, gender identity? And also because it meant that the next time they came into contact with police, it would change the way the interaction went. So I just feel like people sometimes want data because they think it'll make their policy arguments easier, and they really don't think about what that's gonna look like in people's everyday lives. So I just wanna name that. And then, in this moment, things like what was your first language or where were you born? That information is information for ICE, and that's in 1 million municipal databases. That's information you have to give to get your welfare benefits. That's what information you have to get your food stamps, right? And now it's also an opportunity for surveillance. So I just really want to name that, and just name that in this moment, the ICE police collaboration agreements have doubled around the country, so the official collaboration has doubled around the country. And also there are no longer any priorities, everybody's a target. And that ICE is starting to go into places where they technically, at least before, didn't go. So whether it's courthouses, where DV survivors are trying to go to get orders of protection, daycare, schools, hospitals are now targets. So many of you might have seen, a young girl, 12-year-old girl with cystic fibrosis who went into the hospital and then was deported from the hospital. Pregnant people are going to get prenatal care, and ICE is trolling the hallways in the hospitals. So people are having to decide, am I going to get prenatal care and risk deportation or not, because of this notion, these criminalizing notions that immigrant women come here to have children to then fraudulently steal immigration status somehow, right? And that is driving the enforcement practices. So, and then, hospitals and social services agencies, by information collecting, but also through practices, collude in that. So for instance, there was a woman in Houston, which is supposed to be a sanctuary space, who went to get medical care, and because the ID she used was in some way obviously not her, I think the gender marker actually might have been the mark that it was male and she was presenting for a gynecological problem and transphobia, et cetera. And so the hospital called to report this fraudulent attempt to access health care, and of course who comes involved is ICE, but the hospital's saying, well, we didn't call ICE. We're just doing this criminalizing thing that we're doing. We're policing fraud, right? And everybody agrees fraud is bad. And so I think we just really need to think about information sharing, but also the many different ways that criminalization can bring people into contact, even in spaces that are supposedly safe. I think that's what I would say about that. And then just also, we didn't talk about school resource officers. We'll hear a lot more about that later on, but I think school resource officers are very much in conversation with ICE, and that there are many situations where school resource officers will just say, I think that person's in a gang, because they talked to someone in the hallway who I think is in a gang because they drew a Chicago Bulls logo on their notebook, and I think that's MS-13. And then literally ICE is coming in and pulling people out and putting them into deportation proceedings based on that, and it's not always young men of color, it's sometimes young women of color, based on who they talk to in the hallway. And so I think we need to really think about how police presence in all of our public institutions is then meaning that ICE is present in all of our public institutions, because officers are taking it upon themselves to share information based on little or nothing.
I was just gonna say quickly, before ICE became the Abolish ICE movement, where ICE became a household topic, police officers have been encouraged or even excited to try to figure out how to enforce immigration policy before ICE became a mainstream conversation. So actually, my original scatting project with the advancement project was to file complaints against officers and police departments, municipalities in Georgia and North Carolina, because they have these super restrictive driving laws that they were used as proxies to do immigration surveillance and enforcement. And so, yeah, even though, local police departments aren't supposed to do immigration enforcement, they're like, oh, we're just pulling people over who are breaking the law, right? But if you have this complex, nuanced set of laws that you are using to racially profile and harass people of color, it's like, oh, I think this also works for immigration enforcement as well, right? And so what they're doing is not only are they information sharing, with tactics and through these collaborations with ICE, they're also doing that with other police departments. And, even if ICE didn't exist, it wouldn't be as if immigrants or undocumented folks are going to be less surveilled, because we have police departments who are willing to do that job anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think this question about data and data sharing is so important, and I think Professor Roberts' work demonstrates why. Right, so the loss of informational privacy can lead to the substantive loss of rights, to the substantive loss of the right to privacy, and so one of the ways I think this is really important to note is obviously when you think about how policing occurs. Right, we've had a lot of real and important conversations and critiques about broken windows policing. Particularly a lot of the work that Andrea has been doing in New York around stop and frisk and so forth, really challenging this idea of predictive, proactive policing and the real harms and violence that happens in communities as a result. But when we think about the less apparent ways in which data can produce the same kind of results, I think we really need to be thinking about that. So when we use data to engage in sort of the same kind of predictive policing, right? So hotspot policing. So I'm learning a lot about this being on the Civilian Oversight Commission. So what happens now is every day there's something called PredPol, which is, and ComStat, which is this sort of proprietary software that looks at arrest records and takes sort of publicly available data about like where purchases are occurring and things that have nothing to do with what we traditionally associate with crime, to make predictions about when crime will be occurring, and patrol cars and police resources that are then assigned as a result. And as you might predict, they're put into traditionally poor, traditionally Black, traditionally Latino communities, and it's essentially sanitizing deeply racialized data, right? And so that, I think, is deeply, deeply troubling. Some of what was mentioned earlier about what's happening in Chicago, where police are taking data and going to people and saying, you're on our hot list, right? You haven't committed any crimes, but we think you will. And so just know that we're keeping our eye on you, right? And so just watch out, right? And some are saying, well, this is good because we can get these folks resources and so forth. But again, it's this idea of sort of this minority report that we're tagging folks as criminal before they've committed any crimes based on an algorithm making predictions. And I think, again, this is deeply troubling. Not only is this happening in the context of our criminal legal system, it's also occurring in our civil system, with regard to, for example, our foster care systems in Allegheny County. I think they're using similar sorts of predictive technologies. LA County is toying with similar sorts of ideas, and they're even, I think in some jurisdictions, in some iterations of the software, have used race or the race of one of the parents as a predictor of abuse of children. Right, so data and publicly available data, which doesn't implicate any sort of Fourth Amendment privacy rights, is deeply, deeply troubling in terms of how it's being used, the kinds of algorithms, the racial disparities that are being produced, and the types of communities that are already deeply traumatized, deeply violated, deeply criminalized and incarcerated by these systems will just, again, be targeted. But instead, the state will be able to justify those outcomes by a so-called objective process that's being justified by the data. And I think we really need to be thinking about how this is occurring. The other thing that's, I think, also really deeply troubling is the way in which this data sharing is occurring as a result of reforms that folks are calling for, like body cameras, for example, right? So we have these body cameras in LA County. We have a body camera program that's the proposed cost is something like $250 million per year just to maintain these body cameras. And the body cameras potentially can be cross-referenced with biometric surveillance software, which can identify people right, based on, their facial structures and so forth at airports. And so there are real concerns about how some of the data that's collected through body camera technology is going to be used broadly 10, 15 years from now. So there are a lot of questions about how law enforcement agencies are going to use things like body cameras that are now being touted as reforms to challenge uses of force, police misconduct, that may in fact be turned on communities and used as another way to abuse our basic and fundamental rights. So I think there are a lot of concerns regarding data and different kinds of surveillance technologies like body cameras and drones.
I have one more.
Oh, you go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna quote Jay-Z really quickly.
Oh, you should quote Jay-Z.
So Jay-Z.
Although I have questions.
Okay, well we can, well, anyway, so let me quote Jay-Z really quickly. So Jay-Z has these two bars that I really like. And he says, I don't be on the gram, going ham, giving information to the pork, man, that's all spam. Yeah, I get it? Mm-hmm. Okay, so basically, Instagram, Facebook, he said he doesn't go online to give information to the pork are pigs, pigs are cops, Black Panthers. And so he said he doesn't do that because it's spam, it's information that they use, is low-level information that they then use and exploit. So we have to be protective from these, agencies, but we also have to be protected from ourselves. Because what's happening is that we're diminishing the expectation of privacy. How can I say that I didn't know that, they didn't want their profile searched when you're putting pictures of ultrasounds? It's like, well, if we are putting pictures of ultrasounds before the ultimate, being comes into, existence, and then, that person wasn't able to give consent about whether this, thing that was traditionally very, very private is now is on public display. There are a group of organizers in Puerto Rico who are facing charges for disrupting a meeting. And they said that the police officers who got, their data, what they did was contacted Facebook. And Facebook created a link where they could just type in the activist's name and just log in as if they're that activist. Right? So now, all of their messages, all those private communications, conversations, the easiest way was for them to communicate at the time was using Facebook and I think not WhatsApp or something like that. So now you have, information oversharing or over information, constantly snapping this, Instagramming that, doing a story on this, posting about that. And all that's being tracked. And we also know that that's been used, or at least I can speak to the way that's been used against Black activists about how Facebook has been willingly, turned over data to law enforcement not using it, not being subpoenaed and sharing that information anyway. So we live in a culture of, information overload, and we're contributing to the power of the police to do that surveillance. So you're welcome for you guys.
That, for real, there was a gang sweep in New York where 200 young people were swept up using largely just connections through Facebook. And I've been in an office, a law enforcement office with a young person where the officers like typed some things in, turned around and been like, this is your Facebook page, right?
Yeah.
And she was like, wait, I made that private. And I was like,
Private.
not so much private. But also the thing I was going to jump in and say is that I taught policing last semester and learned a lot of things. And one of them was that the deployment of police officers to neighborhoods is based in large part on the number of single Black women-headed households. That's literally the information they're using to deploy police in the neighborhood, and part of it is because those are neighborhoods that have the highest rates of poverty, but also because of these notions of deviance of Black mothers and Black mothers producing deviance in their families and criminality. I mean, it's literally part of this process of criminalization. And it means that when algorithms that are supposedly race neutral are used to assess someone's suitability for bail, for instance, that Black women come up as less suitable for bail and more highly dangerous than white serial killers, literally.
Right.
Someone who has been convicted of or is charged with shoplifting because of the way the algorithms are racially shaped by racially disparate data will literally produce a dangerous rating for Black women that is much higher than someone who's literally killed several people in another state. And there's, again, organizing efforts to get rid of gang databases in Chicago, led by BYP 100, and organized communities against deportation, and Mi Gente, that are about recognizing that this kind of information gathering that's happening to create hotspot policing and gang policing is this kind of problematic racially charged information gathering that then feeds people into ICE. People are less excited, though, about organizing to end sex offender registry databases, and I feel like we need to be able to confront the things that we maybe think should be criminalized or that feel like they are actually connected to safety, and make the links to the things that we can understand that are actually not connected to safety.
So I do want to transition into Q&A, but first I just kind of want to ask a closing question that is a little bit broad, but I think that there's obviously a common conception that policing is an important feature of community safety. So I want to ask, what do you see, if any, as being the role of police in communities, and what you see as kind of a vision for a system where there can be accountability if harm has occurred against someone?
Well, look, I think if you have a healthy community, police don't play a role really at all, right? I think if you look at, when I'm sometimes asked to be in panels, and I remember one time I was at a event in Beverly Hills, and I'm like, you in Beverly Hills, you don't see police at all, right? The police are a negligible presence. Why? Because that is a well-resourced community, right? The police are the exception and not the rule. They have a great, they have well-resourced hospitals, schools, folks are fully employed with good jobs, the housing is safe, the kids have great parks, after-school resources, right? If there are issues, if there are traumas, the kids can get to see therapists, right? If there is areas where there are harm, there are spaces of accountability, right? The police are seldom called, right? If there are issues, there are resources to deal with them. There's a great program called $1 Million Hoods that tracks where folks are arrested in LA County. There are very few arrests that come from those zip codes, right? Because the police aren't called. That signals that that is a healthy community. So that's my answer, right? Very little to negligible, right? But if you come to the zip code that's adjacent to the neighborhood I live in, 90044, that is the most policed neighborhood in LA County. That signals to me, and that means the police are saturated in that community. signals to me that there is a complete and total breakdown, that there is dysfunction because of the role and the saturation of police, law enforcement, and incarceration in that community. The police, if we can get the police out of that neighborhood, and so that means there are billions of dollars being spent on police rather than schools, rather than housing, rather than on education, rather than on trauma-informed care, right? If we could transform those dollars, those billions of dollars on all of those things, we would have a healthy, functioning neighborhood where we wouldn't need the police, where we wouldn't need jails, where we wouldn't need prisons. And so that's my answer. The police would play no to a negligible role in our communities if we have a healthy community.
Yeah, in the words of Soulja Boy, police, police. That's sort of how I feel about, a world, in the future. I think I was going to give a comparable example of Ladue, which is like the Beverly Hills of Missouri, and compare that to St. Louis, right? So places like Beverly Hills and Ladue exist because, police are saturated in places like St. Louis City, right? Those areas are well resourced, and the police are the occupying force in places like St. Louis City. Because if not, then the people who have been oppressed and exploited would just then go and take the resources from people who live in Ladue, and they would go and take the resources from people who live in Beverly Hills, and they should. So I view the police as an occupying force to precisely maintain the imbalance of resources. And one reason why there's an imbalance of resources, one primary reason is because of capitalism, right? I can't imagine a world where capitalism is the predominant, economic way of life that also, it doesn't have an important role for police. So in order to reduce and eliminate and shrink the carceral state, we must have serious conversations about shrinking, reducing our reliance on capitalism, because that's what maintains the amount of exploitation that we see in this country and in this world. That's sort of what I think about police and prisons. I think that we seriously have to think about what sort of world, and I don't think we need police now, but we have to, like I said before in my introduction, think about how to be responsive to why people commit certain types of harm and certain types of violence. So you talked about self-defense. People kill people in self-defense. People, kill people for all types of reasons. I think there are ways that we can unpack those reasons and address the underlying causes. People also kill people because of homophobia. Well, more jails does not create less homophobia. It can actually beget more homophobia, right? So if we're trying to reduce harm, we must think about the underlying causes of harm and invest and seek to reduce those. So I think invest, divest works, but I think it's going to require much, 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 much more investment. There's simply not enough money in police or in prisons to do the kind of transformational change that we need in this country. We have to have some sort of, reordering of society, a much, much, much broader and bolder, reimagination of society. And people are, doing that work. They're doing that work not only in criminal justice, but they're doing that work in climate change and food justice, in education, in the arts. It's how people are, pushing us to think about a different world, the visionaries. That sort of transformational change is going to have to require us to think about a new, different type of society. And, BYP 100 was shouted out, a bunch this time because that's some of the work that they do in D.C. Once they bail black mamas out of jail, they also employ them above the minimum wage. And because they're a grassroots organization, they don't have tons of funding, but they make sure that every person who gets bailed out has a place to eat, has organized, if they want to do organizing work, can be trained to do that, and is given a job, and is given a community, and that's how they're building and experimenting with that work. In Puerto Rico, Tyler Salud, if someone has been accused of being a murderer, they don't call the police. They do letter writing campaigns. Then they knock on their door and say, yo, what's going on? Why are they beefing? And they rely on, women of color to do that work. It's not primarily men. It's all of the street violence interruptions and doing that work are women of color. And they've drastically reduced, the homicide rate in Louisa because of this, visionary work of, if the underlying causes are related to economic deprivation, how can we then, supplement the economic deprivation and reduce tensions between warring communities because there's not enough jobs, or the schools are closing because of all these austerity measures that the United States is putting on that, on that island, right? So the people who are tackling with the root causes of these issues and experimenting in different ways, that's where my hope lies. And there are no police there.
What they said. The resources, I think that for addressing immediate harm in communities now, we've delegated everything to the police, right? My neighbor's making too much noise, police. My neighbor downstairs, I hear her getting thrown around, police. Everything is about that, and it's about figuring out how to actually take responsibility back, right? And to be like, I'm actually responsible for your safety, I'm responsible for your safety, and I'm responsible for the safety of every Black trans woman in this town, and I need to figure out what I'm gonna do to create the conditions for them to be safe and be accountable to it. And it doesn't mean I have to respond to every incident, because that's not sustainable, and I feel like that ends up being part of the problem, is that we're trying to build infrastructure to match a scale of problem that is much larger than anything I can personally do, and we often then burn ourselves out in that process. So I think it's about engaging each and every one of us. So in the work of ending state violence means each of us has to be engaged in the work every single day of imagining a world in which we are mutually responsible for each other's safety, and not just being, surviving, but thriving. And that means checking in on your friends when you feel like there's dynamics in their relationships that you're not sure about, that you are willing to engage in processes that are long and hard, and there's resources for you to do that. Mariam Kaba just put out a website called Transforming Harm that has a lot of information about how we in communities can already start engaging in those processes individually and in building the infrastructure so that we can do it collectively. But I think that what you learn by examining policing and state violence through the lens of women's experiences, you get much more quickly to the response that police are not safety, police are violence. And police produce more violence than safety, particularly for Black women, particularly for Black women of color, and for Black women who live at the intersections of many forms of oppression. And so then you don't think that it's just about decriminalizing marijuana or reforming stop and frisk. Right. You get real quick to when the police respond to violence, they commit more violence and don't protect people. And so the myth that they're there to protect the vulnerable just is completely blown open once you see that a police officer shows up to someone who calls for a DV call and beats them within an inch of their lives and leaves them there for dead and says, if you call us again, we'll kill you. Then that blows open the notion that police are actually about what they say they're about, and it really takes us much more quickly to, we need to come up with a different response. It really requires us to reimagine our visions of safety.
And I want to also shout out an organization in LA called Justice LA, and they're doing a lot of great work. They're led by a number of folks, including Patrice Cullors, and what they're trying to do is model a system of accountability where folks can call a team of folks who are trained to intervene in areas where there is in need of support or where there's conflict. Where you can call folks to come and get support without calling the police. And you can actually call folks who are resourced and know that you can get the support that you need, and know that you're not going to compound the harm or the violence that's occurring. So I think that those kinds of models are hugely important and can demonstrate neighborhood models where you can trust folks, where you can build trust with your neighbors, where you can call them and know that you can get an immediate response. And so I'm really hopeful that those sort of immediate models can help transition us to a space where the police aren't the only options when something is happening.
Thanks. And I think the first question I was asked from Q&A was just kind of answered in the last few comments, but I like this question because it's very kind of practical. But the question is, I live in a gentrifying neighborhood. I'm active in my community, but newer neighbors are often quick to call the police. Can you speak to gentrification and the criminalization of race and poverty, and 2 specific things to recommend to someone like me when neighbors are calling the police, basically?
This is really interesting because this is something I'm dealing with myself, so I'm interested in the conversation. Do y'all have something called Nextdoor, the app? I've downloaded this app begrudgingly. When I moved into this neighborhood, it's in LA. It's called. It's just a little south of a neighborhood called Lamert Park, which is a historically black neighborhood, which is not probably 5 years from now will not be historically black. And it's interesting to see the debates between like the new neighbors who are mostly white and the neighbors who've been there for a long time who are mostly black and Latino. It's still mostly black and Latino, but you see the white neighbors constantly posting about like, be aware, a stranger, you know, a black man with a hoodie was walking down the street. And then the black neighbors are like, what about that is suspicious? And then the white person is like, didn't look like he had a reason to be walking down the street. Or, you know, they'll be like, be aware, 2 black youth came to my door selling, you know, candy, ostensibly for a basketball program. And then the black or Latino neighbors will be like, maybe they were selling the candy for a basketball program. So, you know, this is a big issue. So one of the things that, one is, I think, to really push back on the neighbors, right? Not to let their foolishness slide when they offer up these really ridiculous accusations. One, I think, in these sort of conversations. And so we actually have noticed over the last year or so that those kinds of posts have reduced drastically because they are challenged, right? People aren't allowed to get away with making those kinds of comments. Another thing that I thought was quite interesting is I was at a friend's house in DC on U Street, the U Street corridor, and that's a rapidly gentrifying neighborhood as well. It is gentrified. It's completely different. And I was just kind of hanging out. I don't remember what I was doing, but I was hanging out. And this sister comes by, and she basically like appointed herself the block captain. And my friend, who's another law professor, his name's Khaled Beydoun. I don't know if any of you folks know him, but he's a cool dude. He's not black, and he had moved into the neighborhood. He's Lebanese and Egyptian American. And he had moved to the neighborhood probably like 3 years before. And this woman came by, was like, let me tell you about this neighborhood, right? And she was like, let me tell you about the history, and let me tell you about what we do here, right? This is how the neighborhood is run. And, you know, she basically was like, these are the rules, right? And he, you know, that could have gone a lot of different ways. But I thought that was really useful. And it really, I think, introduced, I don't think he would have taken it any kind of different way, but I think in terms of how that introduced the history to him and the other neighbors that were coming in, I think it created a common culture. And I think it created a rapport in terms of the older and newer neighbors, where if there were questions or conflicts, they could talk about them. There were points of entry. And I think that's really important. In terms of my neighborhood, I made it a point immediately to talk to the older neighbors, to introduce myself and to give them my phone number if there were any questions, or if I had questions, if there were anything that came up, they had problems with me. If I had any issues that came up, they could call me, and vice versa. And I think that kind of community building is really important. With the white neighbors, I noticed they didn't necessarily do that. And so I think it's really important to, again, be mindful of that, and to kind of reach out to the white neighbors, especially if they're doing things like calling the police, to really reach out to them and check them. I've had to do that with a white neighbor. There was a man who was living in his car, and he would move his car around and park in front of different people's homes. And the white neighbors were complaining about it and were threatening to call the police on him. And they were going around and trying to enlist the support of different neighbors in terms of doing that. And I said, I'm not in support of doing that. If there's some issues, we need to talk to him directly. And he was like, I'm scared of him. He might do something. I was like, he's just trying to live. You know what I mean? He's obviously attached to this neighborhood, so we should just go talk to him. And it turned out his mother and his family lived on that street. They had lived on a couple houses down, and his mother died. And that's why he was staying on that street. His cousin apparently lived on the block, and his mail was being sent to that address. And so we talked to him, and we were like, can we support you? Can we get you, what can we do to help? And he said he didn't want the help. He liked living where he was living. But we expressed, I supported the neighbor expressing his concerns. He listened, the man in living in his car, and he agreed to move it. And that was it, right? And I was like, that's all you had to do, right? And so we talked about it, and I was like, can you just agree not to call the police on this man, because you could literally cost him his life. And that was it. So I think, just having conversations with the neighbors and really impressing on them the cost of calling the police.
I have two quick things. I saw this really funny meme on Instagram. It's really funny. It said the only way to slow down gentrification is to go outside and shoot a couple of times in the air so the news can report that there were shots fired in that neighborhood, and that would discourage people from coming in. So I think that's one very concrete tactic if you want to slow down gentrification. I think the second thing that people can do is look to organizations or grassroots organizations like Tenants and Workers United. And so I thought this was pretty fascinating. There were a group of tenants who were being exploited by this landlord, and they realized that the workers were also being exploited as well. So they formed a union to resist the landlord. And so, I live in DC. I can't afford to live on U Street, and I'm a Harvard, law grad, who work at a cushy nonprofit, and I literally can't afford it. But I also know that I'm a part of a interesting Black gentrifying class who can live in other parts of DC and force other Black poor people to move into Maryland. I know that I'm a part of that class of gentrifiers. But then it's like, well, we can all live on this block and then resist development. We can all live on this block and resist and organize against landlords who will continue to raise rent. So I'm interested in how people can, have conversations, but also organize to resist the rising costs of rent in places where there's gentrification.
I mean, I agree with everything they said, and that strategy worked for us in Crown Heights for a long time. And then one day it was like all of a sudden there was a flood, and we were like, I guess.
See, what happens is then the white folks catch on to that, and then they start chasing those the way the shots are fired. They're like, now that's the neighborhood to go to.
Exactly, I know. Edgy.
Edgy.
Anyway. But yeah, I mean, I think just getting out in your community, I think that often people, when this conversation on gentrification happens, feel guilt. And I think it's just being responsible for the role that we're playing, and then figuring out, rather than being like, oh my God, I don't know where to live, I'm not going to talk about it because I feel shame or guilt, right? And just actually being a responsible neighbor. And I want to just name also that queers play a huge role, well, not queers, maybe LGBT people play a role in gentrification that also sometimes we're not willing to address kind of I'm talking particularly about white LGBT people, that people are not, exactly, that's why I was not queer, gay, but that role that we're not willing to confront, right? And then people also are like, well, there was homophobia in my neighborhood, that's why I had to call the police. And it's like, well, you just displaced somebody, right? And people, when there's economic tensions, the fissures that capitalism creates in our communities come up, right? And so we have to figure out how to work across that bridge in ways that don't involve criminalizing our neighbors, and figure out how to get to know each other and talk to each other. So I feel like that's a tension that we don't often talk about, whether it's middle class, Black folk, gay folk, or whoever is coming in being like, oh, but, I have a right to be here, and these folks are harming me.
And as much as I was sort of joking, I just also want to note that, as much as we talk about gentrification, that's often the sort of last, that's sort of the last symptom of of a larger set of economic happenings, right? Mm-hmm. Because capitalism is always in search of exploitation. Mm-hmm. And so when we see the gentrification happening in the interpersonal conflicts that I think the questioner was describing, that's often 10 years after decisions have already been made, right? In terms of shifting capital, in terms of housing decisions, transportation lines, development, right? So we need to be engaged at a much larger level, and to be mindful of really sort of discrete decisions that are being made in development in terms of our city councils, county bureaucracies, right? So we need to really be engaged at that level with a lot of our NGOs, nonprofits that really focus on this. It's not sexy, it's not fun, but this is where gentrification, that's the roots of gentrification. These sort of deals around development, affordable housing, right? This is where we really, tax policy, that's where we really need to be engaged. We're focused on gentrification, and this is where policing really becomes important, because police are on the front lines of maintaining the boundaries of gentrification, right? This is where, gang injunctions come in, policing comes in real heavy when development decisions have been made and they need to clear the way for new development to come in.
And that's really where broken windows, which is also called order maintenance policing, comes in. It's about maintaining the existing racial, social, economic order, or the one that's being imposed on a neighborhood. And that's just about it. Thank you for being such a great moderator. We've been very unruly.
Thank you so much. I do think time is up. Sorry we didn't get through as many of the Q&A cards as I would have liked, but I do think you all touched on most of the points that were brought up in the questions, and I do think we have the rest of the day to get a lot more in depth to some of these systems that we've been talking about. Thank you so much to our panelists. We are so happy and honored that you're here. Thank you. The next panel, which is about education, will be starting at around 11, so please be back here, and it'll be moderated by Leila Barigiwa, who is another of the Toll Scholars, and we're very excited. So just try to be here in, like 5-ish to 10 minutes. Thank you so much.